First of all, I'm really so excited to be here. It's always wonderful to have a dialogue with Rojava, and I thank Bremen University for providing the context to do that. I'm also very excited because I think there are right now three huge very important social movements that develop a language alternative to liberalism, that try to develop a global language, a language that can become in a sense a ground for intellectual and practical exchange among different communities. And these three movements are the colonial movement, abolitionist movement, and Kurdish freedom movement. All these three movements are searching for ways to do two things, in my opinion. One of them is taking back the means of production, reproduction, and self-defense that has been stolen from us. And the second one is how to create an autonomous society, a society that can take care of itself, that can actually redistribute these means in democratic ways. But all these three movements are developing in extremely difficult conditions, in conditions where lives are at stake, in conditions where leaders are continuously assassinated, in conditions where people are incarcerated regularly, political speech is censored, liberal integration and liberal kinds of co-optation are in place, and where dominant forces try to steal the language that we are developing among ourselves for finding solutions to our world, to our problems. So I think it's crucial at this point, it's urgent at this point, that these three movements that have a claim for, that have really ambitious claims to change the world as a whole. So these three different movements, three different vocabularies, three different languages, three different worldviews, which are embedded in social movements and action, come in dialogue. So therefore, I want to think about this as one of the initial starts. I mean, we have been trying to do this through different conferences, through Zoom meetings. We are trying to do this to accomplish this dialogue through writing, through supporting each other in protests. But definitely, we have a lot to learn from each other. So I will start with what is common to abolitionism and the democratic confederalist movement in Kurdistan. And then I will say a few words on specifically on what topics we have to have more dialogue to learn from each other. So the first thing I think that Daniel has so importantly underlined is to actually the common thing to all these three movements, the colonial movement, abolitionist movement, and the democratic confederalist movement of Kurdistan, is resistance and construction, demolishing and building has to go hand in hand. This has been emphasized by Abdullah Öcalan, by the leader of the Kurdish freedom movement, numerous times. And he has, in his books that he has written from İmralı prison, he has so importantly underlined again that period for Kurds to resist only is over. Now it is time for construction in the midst of war, violence, and colonialism. And the same idea underlines abolition and decolonialism. I cannot emphasize this enough, since we sometimes assume that, you know, we are in different conditions. We are in the same conditions as far as these movements go. I mean, blacks are under war. They are a war against them is waged. A war against indigenous people are waged. And as the Kurdish women's freedom movement, we have again and again pointed to the fact that in these three movements, the leaders are being assassinated, killed, which is a very recent and common weapon of war that dominant and colonial powers are using. So we are trying to build under these conditions, resist for your life, survive, but also build. So do not live a life, do not survive only, but live a life worth living. Live a life that is valuable because it builds something. That is the common theme, I think, in these movements, which is very different from the liberal way in which we see life. Life is not valued in itself. Life is valuable because it builds an alternative. So that's common. The second thing that is common is that the importance that is given in all of these movements to the abolishment of patriarchy, and doing this through transformative means. The guerrilla in the Kurdish mountains have developed many different means in which man's masculinity and the patriarchal man, the patriarchal order, is questioned, but not by excluding man, but by transforming them, which is very different again from liberal feminism. The same applies for indigenous feminism, for decolonial feminism, and for abolitionist feminism. So in all these three movements, community is important. Community is so important that you cannot exclude or incarcerate anyone, but all energy must go to transformation, to changing those who are dominant. And that doesn't mean being only compassionate to them, but knowing also that they change only if we take the means of production, reproduction, and self-defense that they have stolen from us, from them. So men need to be transformed, but also we as women need to be powerful enough to be autonomous and take these means that men have stolen from us back so that we can change man. So it's a transformation and also resistance and changing ourselves, producing power as women that underlines all these three movements, which I think is also very different from the liberal language and from carceral feminism. So in general, and the third one is, of course, the fact that all these movements also want to abolish the domination of man over nature. So abolitionism, as democratic confederalism, as decolonialism are green movements. As Ruth Gilmore says, they need to be green because they know eventually, but without abolishing the domination of man over nature, we cannot demolish the carceral institutions, the institutions of violence and domination that make up our current social order. Finally, all these movements know, which is again extremely important, I think, that they cannot accomplish these as communities in isolation. So to use the vocabulary of the Kurdish movement, diplomacy, that is attaching and reattaching yourself, negotiating and renegotiating among communities that want to become autonomous is crucial for taking back the means of defense, reproduction and production away from those who have stolen us. So we cannot be we cannot remain in isolation, which is actually, as I will talk about later in this intervention, a problem that we face in Rojava, a problem because we are isolated, because there's an embargo, because we cannot connect with other communities most of the time, because we are disconnected from Kurdistan in general, Kurdistan in Bakur, Kurdistan, Rojava, Kurdistan, Bashur, Kurdistan, but also from the Middle East in general and from the world in general. It is very difficult for us to develop non-carceral means of self-defense and non-carceral means of production and reproduction. I can't underline this enough either. I will come back to that later in my in my talk. So these are the common things. The different thing with abolition specifically now is that divided in 4 geographies, we have different conditions. And I use the word we. I should maybe put a parenthesis on that because I'm not Kurdish, but I use the word we for the Kurdish movement because the Kurdish freedom movement was generous enough to embrace me as one of their own. And as a intrinsically internationalist movement, it has given me a place in their activism and in their practice. So I consider this movement to be mine also. And therefore, I use the word we when I talk about this movement as also a practitioner and activist in the movement. And I thank, of course, the Kurdish freedom movement and all my Kurdish friends for this. Okay, the parenthesis, I close now. So what is different compared to abolitionist movement is that Kurdistan, because Kurdistan's geography is divided, there are different problems and different contexts that we face for example, Bakur and Rojava, 2 places I know better than Rojava and Bashur. In Bakur, we are more like the people, the Black people in the United States. And because we are living under conditions of everyday colonialism, displacement, war, violence, and incarceration. But in Rojava, there is, of course, a self-autonomous government, which means there is more place for exploration and for experimentation. On the one hand, the fact that Rojava is a self-autonomous government gives the Kurds, gives us a chance for building more than people under war, people who have no autonomy, more than people who have no autonomy can have. But on the other hand, because we are under conditions of constant war, and I mean, it's not like, it's not like police violence. It's not like incarceration only. It's a war. It's a war with bombs. It's a war with soldiers. It's a war against ISIS. It's a war against Turkish state. It restricts the possibilities of creating an incarceral state, a incarceral context, a government that has no carceral institutions, a government that can fully democratize self-defense. These are not really fully possible under conditions when we are facing every day with crimes against humanity, with crimes of genocide, with crimes of ethnocide. It's very difficult to imagine, for example, how to use means of transformative justice with ISIS members when we are under existential threat by the Turkish nation state and ISIS, which cooperate to this day. So we must consider these differences. These differences are important because it leads us to different solutions, but it also shows us why we need so much this dialogue, because our imagination becomes restricted by the conditions we live in. Our imagination, in order to extend our imagination, in order to rethink, for example, how we can deal with ISIS members, we need to learn from movements of decolonialism and movements of abolitionism. But abolitionist movements and decolonial movements and transformative justice movements have to also think about what it means to live under conditions of a genocidal threat. How will we address crimes against humanity? I think these questions can only be addressed in a context of dialogue. So we use different languages, as I said in the beginning. We use this language, most importantly, the Kurdish movement uses the language of self-defense on the one hand, and the democratic autonomy on the other hand. Both of these concepts, like abolition, refer to both resistance and building, destruction and making, construction. And I will just, as abolitionism, Daniel has again wonderfully explained how abolitionism has developed within a specific context of slavery, a context where Black people were completely displaced and uprooted in unimaginable ways for us in Kurdistan, because they were separated from their families, and during slavery, they had no natal rights over their children. They had no right to any kind of land. So unimaginable oppression, unimaginable domination. And it is under these conditions they have developed the ideas, the concepts, the vocabulary, and the language of abolitionism. We have been in a different context. We have been in our lands, but divided into four and under constant genocidal, ethnocidal, and femicidal conditions. And it is here in this context we have developed our own language, our own vocabulary. And Abdullah Öcalan has been the architecture of this language and vocabulary, but this language and vocabulary through Rojava's building and through Bakur's resistance has now evolved into even more into a more sophisticated language. And self-defense is crucial. What does self-defense mean? I have been saying this throughout my talk, but I will say it again here. I mean, colonialism, oppression, domination means that man the state and capitalists have taken away from us the means for production, reproduction, and self-defense, and made themselves the authorities which organize production, reproduction, and defense in society. And by that way, they have made society small and themselves big. What we are trying to do is taking those means back so we can become autonomous and we can become bigger than the state. In conditions of Rojava, that means that the self-government is a radical democracy that becomes a mediator, that becomes an agent that helps the reproduction, the distribution, redistribution of these means democratically. In Bakur, in Turkey's Kurdistan, it means taking these means back by building institutions that will make the state obsolete. In that sense, it is very similar to abolition. And different from abolition, we have a name for how such a redistribution can be made sustainable. And that we call democratic confederalism. I mean, this is not a speech about democratic confederalism, but I am underlying this to say that, for example, in our dialogue with abolitionism, by talking about our experiments with democratic confederalism, we have also something to teach them as much as to learn from them, because we have a sophisticated theory about what we mean by making sustainable the institutions we have built while we abolish things, which we call democratic confederalism. And intrinsic to democratic confederalism is dialogue and diplomacy and sharing experience and making things together. Okay. Now, in Rojava, I will come in a minute to Bakur, but first let me say a few words about Rojava. In Rojava, Malajin, women's houses, people's houses, and the AStA have been the three most important institutions of abolition. And as we name it in Kurdistan, self-defense and democratic confederalism. Malajin and Malagel, people's houses and women's houses, have applied transformative justice without calling it transformative justice since the start of the revolution. And again, it is important to underline that this practice was not new to Kurdistan, but it has, of course, a long history in the traditions of Kurdistan, and of course, a long history as it was practiced by the guerrilla themselves when they tried to transform themselves away from their patriarchal selves. So there is this history that comes from the mountains on the one hand, and that comes from tradition on the other hand. In the mountains, the tradition has been feminized, and it has been feministized, if you want. It has been remembered and rebuilt in ways that will go against patriarchy, against patriarchal against the patriarchal culture within which they were built. But so abolitionist justice, transitional, transformative justice has been practiced in Malajin and Malagel in systematic ways, which has actually resulted in a majority of cases involving violence in the community to be solved without going in any court. I think this is a major accomplishment. Major accomplishment. The second institution is AStA, And I think asayish has many problems, as far as I know, in the sense of because it sometimes monopolizes the means of defense, it can become a problem. But the idea of asayish has been to creating self-securities, self-defense units in every community and commune, which means the democratization of the means of self-defense, which is, I think, very important, and an abolitionist maneuver, which the black in the United States have also tried and have been trying, and Black Panthers have been a very, very important example in that regard. So we have, again, a lot to teach to each other in the ways in which we have, as people, found ways to democratize the means of self-defense. I don't want to say the means of violence, because I used to say violence, the means of violence, but I say now the means of self-defense, because I think when means of self-defense is democratized, then we don't talk about violence. Violence is the very fact that means of self-defense are monopolized in certain hands. And democratization of it means violence is abolished, in a sense. Okay. In Bakur, on the other hand, before the huge attack of the Turkish state in 2015 and 2016 to the movement of autonomy in Bakur, there were many institutions which we can consider abolitionists, which have tried to make the state obsolete. But all these institutions have been destroyed by the war that the state waged against Kurds since 2015. And we are now facing a completely carceral state. And it is very interesting to see how the Turkish government has learned from the United States government by not only producing political prisoners, Kurdish political prisoners, but also Kurdish common criminals, like Kurdish people who are selling drugs, or who are doing patriarchal violence, or all of these tend to be much more incarcerated compared to middle-class Turks, for example, which is very similar to the United States. So there is an incarceral state operating both through political prisoners and through common prisoners in Turkey as well. So in that sense, we have to learn a lot from the Blacks of how to resist a carceral state. Because, as I said before, we have been restricted in terms of our abolitionist ideology by the very fact, because we have been fighting for years to bring criminals against humanity to justice and imprison them. So to avoid that imagination, to get rid of that imaginary, and to rethink abolition, to think about abolition as a worldview is very important. And in terms of course, carceral feminism, the Turkish feminist movement is very, very carceral. So the Kurdish women's movement and feminist movement need to also go against carceral feminism of Turkish women and develop with them together an understanding of a fight against carceral feminism. Now, I wanted to, rather than, what I wanted to do basically was comparing and contrasting our own vocabulary, our own experience with the experience of abolition and with the concepts of abolition. I thought that might open up some dialogue and some discussion, and that would bring also into the conversation our friends, our comrades from Rojava, and to think of together about certain problems we face, to take this opportunity as a platform for extending our imagination to incorporate certain means that Blacks have developed that in the world. So I will finish here and yeah, delegate it to or give the words to Bremen again. Thank you for listening to me, and once again, thanks.